Thank you all for joining us today. I am so excited for all of you that are leaning into this conversation. I am so thrilled to introduce our panel today. We have Micah Carlos from the Salt River community in Arizona. She is Akimel Otham, Tana Otham, and Peeposh. She recently graduated from the Arizona State University with a Bachelor's of Science in American Indian Studies and a minor in psychology. She was currently serving as a member of the Center for Native American Youth Advisory Board, and as a board member for the National Indian Child Welfare Association. In both positions, she advocates on behalf of Native American youth across the country in areas such as mental health resources, language revitalization, and cultural preservation. Currently, Micah is employed by her community in serving youth and their families. We're also joined by Kim Finney, a senior fellow with the Center for Rural Strategies. She has served as the vice president of program design for Youth Build USA, where she collaborated with senior leaders to craft their strategic direction, as well as lead the design and implementation of training and organizational learning across education and career pathways and life skills for our rural, native, and urban youth. She joined Youth Build USA in 2001 to design the national initiative to create and strengthen education and career pathways for rural and native opportunity youth. She served as a senior director of rural and native initiatives, overseeing technical assistance and training to over 70 rural and native youth build programs. Across these roles, Kim has worked on a broad range of policy issues related to rural and native youth in their communities. And we have Lexi James, who is a 25-year-old member of the Tewa and Hopi tribes. She is Corn Clan from the village of Tewa, and her Hopi name is Pongsi, which she will correct me because I'm sure I have butchered that with my accent working through indigenous language there. Her mother is Jacqueline James. Most of her time goes to advocating for her platform, The Journey Isn't Over, which is suicide prevention and mental health wellness. James is currently employed by the youth liaison for the Hopi Opportunity Youth Initiative. Aside from her job and title, she's also the co-founder of Nurturing Indigenous Intelligence, a grassroots organization that is committed to supporting Indigenous students. She also sits as a board member of the nonprofit Three Precious Miracles, which is dedicated to assisting Native children in foster care, kinship care, or that are adopted. We are so excited that you all have leaned into this conversation, and that when we talk about rural communities and how we can build them, we often leave a lot of people out, and that includes our LGBT and queer communities that often aren't considered part of the stereotype in the way we see rural communities portrayed. And as we jump into this conversation, if you guys feel things that make you uncomfortable or you have questions, please share. We want this to be a lean-in conversation with our audience, because we understand that allyship is navigating uncharted waters. It's diving into a life that you have not lived and trying to imagine something and trying to resonate and empathize with those communities. So it's something that we all need to enter with a growth mindset, because you are going to mess up. I am going to mess up in this panel. We are all going to mess up in ways that we show up as an ally, but that's the point, is that being an ally is committed to learning and doing better as we go. So with that, welcome. And I'd love to start our conversation, which again, we hope is very much conversational with our audience and our panelists here. When we talk about allyship, I think we've all seen models of good allies or what you're supposed to do. My question for our group here, and we can start with maybe Kim, when has allyship not shown up for you? When have you expected someone to be an ally and been let down?
That's a really good question. So I would, instead of telling an anecdotal moment or story, I'd like to name a behavior that I have seen consistently show up, that I think certainly all of us on this panel and many, if not all of the folks in the audience will be able to resonate with. And that's how it is that members of the LGBT community, and especially when they're wearing more than one identity, right? So when they're walking across particularly race and being a member of the queer community, collectively, we are frequently asked to show up and be thought partners, to step up, have the courage to speak out, be strong, and also be endlessly nurturing, right, to our straight counterparts and colleagues, and support them, right? And then there's always that moment, not always, but when allyship has failed, where it takes a turn and that becomes threatening, right? And we become something that needs to be contained, right? So it's doing all the heavy lifting and then the need for containment. In the workplace, through my career, this has shown up in a couple of ways. And one is just that delegitimizing in the evoking of stereotypes. So, and I think this is super important. Like, I can point to endless examples of how this has happened. And that's that stereotype of the domineering lesbian, right? For women of color, and particularly for Black women, that's the angry lesbian. But it's just that way that particularly our straight allies and our allies, right, and our straight women friends, you think that you're doing this walk with them, and then suddenly, you know, they manipulate that stereotype for their own power and advantage. So suddenly it's the so-and-so is just got really strong opinions or really angry, right? Like, you know, they're just really strident, right? They're just a little too outspoken. I'm just not sure what to do with their energy. I'm not sure this is a good fit, right? Like all the ways that happens. That's just one of those insidious ways. And then what it means is that we don't see representation in leadership over and over again. And I think that that's a really, really useful question to ask, as much as all of us are sitting here with, you know, bios of doing really hard work, you know, as a whole, if you're in the audience, ask yourself, how many queer people are in real leadership in your organizations and in your communities, right? Sitting on your select boards, sitting on your school boards. And if they are, what's it like to be the only one, right? And what does that mean, right? And how are you undermining those questions?
Yeah, I resonate a lot to that of what does it feel like to be the only one? Where in most rooms, I'm generally like the only queer or the only hillbilly, but always the only queer hillbilly, you know, that's in the room. And Lexi and Micah, you guys, you know, we talk about like such intersecting identities of rural, of indigenous, of queer. Like how have you navigated those waters as your allies have failed you? Maybe Micah, and then we'll go to Lexi.
For myself, I think where I've seen it, and that's kind of a space you would most expect it, you know, when it's your family. You know, you always kind of count on your family to be your strongest supporter, your biggest ally. So when you don't get that support, it's like a twofold punch. You know, you feel that lack of support, but also it's the people who you counted on the most and who are the closest to you. And coming from a community where everybody's kind of considered your extended family, not having that support it's an even bigger thing. You know, as you move through the community and as you move through different roles, it can be really tough, especially when people feel like you know, how Kim had said, you know, there's stereotypes that they are holding you to. They will call you on it. And in my community and in my like family and extended family and friends group, you know, we're not shy to speak our minds. And there's kind of a thing with like Native humor is that, you know, it's sometimes a little bit crass, and you know, somebody's friends with you if they're teasing you, and if they don't like you, it's because they're super polite to you. And so sometimes those jokes and comments can get really hurtful when it's about something that's so ingrained in you and part of your identity. And so I think that's always been the hardest part, is not being able to find an ally within, for me, for my community, and then also, you know, my close family. But on the flip side of that, my extended community, well, my community in general, you know, are some of my strongest allies. People who aren't blood related to me, but have taken me in as their child, their bonus child, as they like to call me, and will fight for me and defend me and defend who I love and protect my rights, and are fighting for their own children to make sure that they have those rights as well. So it's a very complicated issue.
Yeah, I think we all get that, like, we've all heard the anecdote of the love the sinner, hate the sin. And it makes me think of like Ibram Kennedy's quote, like there's no such thing as not racist. Like you're a racist or you're anti-racist. Like, And it's hard to look at your family and be like, if you're not fighting for my rights, my friends, like if you're not voting in my interests, fighting for me, like you are homophobic. Like that's unfortunately the reality that's hard for folks to swallow. Absolutely. Lexi, what about you? What has been your allyship letdown?
I can definitely agree with Micah on the native humor and trying to navigate the line where, it's a joke and then there's that one, tiny step for that joke, it does become offensive. And I've always been very open about my sexuality and even in the positions that I've held in the community, a lot of people didn't agree with it. A bisexual woman shouldn't be in charge of anything. She shouldn't be working with their youth. She shouldn't be doing this. And I think one of my biggest letdowns is when I hear, like a slur. And it's so unfortunate that there's a lot of, it's become so normalized where people just say it and they don't think it has any negative connotation behind it, and even starting to educate. And I really appreciate my friend group when someone will hear someone use a slur and they'll be like, hey, we don't use that word, it's not okay. We don't say things like that. And slowly but surely, we're starting to get into this period of education. But I definitely it's really hard to navigate and figure out who your true allies are, especially in your family and your community. And one of my biggest, I think, eye openers was a community member that I've known for years, has always supported me, always been, I'm proud of you, whether I'm giving speeches, whatever it is. And her daughter had contacted me and was like, I'm so proud of you. And her daughter is also part of the LGBTQ community. And she said, I'm really glad that my mom gives that support to you, because I don't know what that's like, because my mom told me that I'm wrong for being the way that I am. And it was a big eye opener for me, because I started to wonder, how many people are being supportive of me just to save face, in public view, while they're telling their family members that, you're wrong for being gay, and giving them that just non-support. And that was probably one of my biggest letdowns, was seeing how people will treat different gays. It's really hard to navigate, like why can't, we support everyone and not just like a select few? Or why do my friends or people that I was friends with at one time support me and my rights, but there's another gay Indigenous youth that they're not supporting? Who do we judge on who to support? Why are we picking and choosing? That's probably been one of my biggest letdowns with allyship.
Yeah, I think, you're spot on. And I think of, my own friends who maybe make like a slightly inappropriate comment while I'm around. And I'm always like, what do you say when I'm not in the room? Like, you felt comfortable enough saying that to me. Like, what happens when you're not in there? Because I think allyship happens when the oppressed aren't in the room. Like racism exists without minorities in the room, and homophobia exists without queers in the room. And I recently listened to a great podcast that had John Amici talking about allyship, and he had said, like, your culture is the worst behavior you'll tolerate. And that was something I took back for all the communities that I may not identify with, but I want to be an ally for. And I was like, what's the joke I've heard that I let go unchecked? What's the comment I heard that I didn't check? And yeah, that's what you're talking about. Like, these folks are doing things unchecked, but then they're publicly supporting, and showing up in a way where I was like, allyship isn't about being in with our community. It's about going home and getting your cousins. It's about taking care of the folks who are in our community and helping them join in. And so, throughout this theme, I've heard, talk about youth and how that's kind of been a common thread within all of us, is like working for youth. And so my question is, like, as a, queer youth, like, Lexi, you talk about having always been out. What was like the experiences that you had that you want to rectify? Like, what did it feel like as a rural queer youth going through these experiences? And what is it you're trying to make sure other people don't experience?
A big part, I guess, in understanding when I talk about that, I've always been very open. I came out when I was about a freshman. I'm currently 25 years old. And that was a big step for me. And it wasn't until later when I realized that I shouldn't have to come out, if that makes sense. And that's something that I really try to talk with about the youth that I work with. Whether even if they're not queer, they're not gay, trying to remind them, we're all learning here. I want this space to be a safe space for you. And so that's probably one of the biggest things that I try to rectify or try to, set up is safe spaces, because I remember when I was, being open about who I was, there wasn't a safe space. I didn't have anyone to talk to. My mom was like, nope, no daughter of mine is gonna be, no child of mine is gonna be gay. And that really hurt, but I was very thankful for the extended family, the clan members, the village members who were very accepting of me and, wanting to learn. That was probably one of the biggest wins, was people wanting to learn. Okay, what can I learn about the LGBTQ community? How can I best support you? And that's something that I try to enforce or bring about in my daily life. Is there's kids that are facing the same issues that I faced when I was that young, and there's probably a bit more issues now with the pandemic happening, and a lot of issues that are ongoing that I didn't have to go through. But if I can create those safe spaces for them, and let them know, how important and valued and accepted that they are, and offer that education to our allies. There's no time like now to learn and to say, okay, maybe what I was taught initially was wrong, and now I'm learning this new information and can be better support for the kids who are going to take these positions from me, who are going to lead eventually down the line, and we'll have a more inclusive community, a more accepting community.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's all about wanting to learn more, right? Like it's 2021. If you don't understand gay culture, like there's Pose, I don't recommend the L word, but there's plenty of other content, right? Of figuring out about our lives. Like if you're not educated about a culture you're not a part of, like you have the opportunity, go educate yourself, learn more of those identities. Micah, what about yourself? Like in your coming out, like what did that look like? What spurred it, or yeah?
For myself, I never really ever came out. My friends always just, I'm very a masculine presenting person, and so I've kind of always been the tomboy. I've been in sports since I could walk, and it's just the role I lived. And I think by kind of just living the life and not really caring about, I guess, kind of these gender norms and what I'm supposed to be doing, I just really like to live how I'm comfortable. And so if that means wearing what I want, talking the way I want, doing what I want. And so for myself, it's always just kind of been that way, that I'm, I just do whatever. That's just Micah. That's just Micah doing Micah's thing. And so for myself, I never really, I guess, came out to my friends and to a general public where it was a big thing. I did eventually have a conversation with my parents, just because I was starting to move into more serious relationships, and I was raised by an extremely religious mother, and in her faith, being gay is wrong. Being gay means that you're a sinner, and so for her, I knew that conversation needed to be had, because there was going to need to be some processing and some understanding, and also for myself, kind of gauging where does this leave our relationship. So having that conversation with my mom was it was a difficult conversation, but also it was interesting in that her response was to think that something had happened to me, something traumatic had happened to make me this way. Her asking, what made you decide to do this? What happened to you? Who hurt you? Was it a bad experience? And me having to tell her, none of that, it's nothing like that. And also having to explain to her, nothing's wrong with me. Nothing in me and nothing about who I love and the way I choose to live my lifestyle needs to be prayed for, to pray to be fixed. Specifically, I told her, I don't need to be fixed. And please do not pray for me to be fixed. I think that'd be very insulting. And so having that conversation with her definitely was very eye-opening, also in the fact that, it did leave our relationship different. She did say she needed time to process and asked me to not bring any of my partners around. And for me, I was okay with that because I only wanted to be around people who were supportive anyways. So that wasn't that hard of an issue. But on the flip side of it, not even, I don't think I ever really had the conversation with my dad. I brought my girlfriend one time to a holiday dinner and I was like, hey, this is my girlfriend. And he was like, cool, hi, I'm Micah's dad and this is my wife and, make a plate. And so he was just very chill about it. And I love him for that. And before he had passed away, he kind of had a conversation with us that no matter what, he just wanted us to be happy. And so that was all that mattered to him, is that we were happy and that we were loved. And so that was my experience in kind of with my friends, like mentioning like, oh yeah, I'm dating so-and-so. And it's like, by the way, I'm gay. And they're like, yeah, we've been knowing for like years. Are you just realizing it? And it was kind of a joke between us in my friend group. But yeah, so it was very much just, living my life, and everybody kind of just accepted that. And if they didn't, then they just weren't a part of my life. So.
Yeah, I love what you said about being just Micah. Like, isn't that a dream of like, I don't have to be anything beyond just myself and accepted for whatever that boundary is. I have a whole other theory about why dads love lesbian daughters and what that says about how men treat women. So that's a whole other conversation for later. And Kim, I know you, as someone who had been out and living out with your partner, you had a very different coming out professionally. Could you share kind of that story and how that felt to go through that?
Sure. So so let me just, say that I, came out as a young adult. I grew up deep in a religious right cult. And so coming out for me, was that personal, let me just point out how religion is a theme across all four of us and what we're sharing about that experience, right? So for me, it was staggered, right? There was coming out to myself and my close friends, and then needing to be able to get myself safe enough to a place in young adulthood because I knew that I would be disowned, and I didn't know what other ramifications would come from that. So I was very much that young person that was really on the fault lines around this. And I've always sort of carried that forward, right? There's a way in which we all know we stand on the shoulders of the members of our community before us that couldn't actually live out lives. But, kind of once piggybacking on Lexi and Micah, what you're saying, once you've gone through the fire, right? It's like, this is my life and how I'm going to live it. For me, what that has meant in particularly in rural communities, and being, middle-aged, right, is being the first, right? The first out. So the first out professionally in spaces, and particularly moving through rural spaces, the first out in my community, the first out parenting family in the school, right? The first with my partner of 30 years, my spouse of 30 years, right? And so always sort of being on display. And to speak to your question, LB, about professionally, an anecdote that I'll tell is a story that I've told more than once, but is pretty apropos for this moment, pretty much exactly 10 years ago, I wound up coming out, so to speak, at a Rural Assembly event it was a main stage session. We were doing a panel discussion on rural young people, and, I don't remember all the ins and outs, but basically someone in the audience, a woman in the audience, asked this question, that was calling for, it was a bit provocative, but righteously calling for allyship for LGBTQ youth. And it was that moment where, as someone, it was like, from that community, to not name who I was and speak to that, right? But it was the first time of what it had meant to do that and we were in person in a room in Minnesota. And afterwards, and so I did it. I came out publicly, right? And not that I wasn't out in individual conversations, but it's a very different thing, just like it is for all of you right now in this moment, right? With however many viewers we have out there, because we're out. And afterwards, I had 3 different responses that happened. And this cuts right to this allyship and disappointment. So I had the folks that came to me and said, wow, I'm so inspired. You're so brave. I can't believe you did that. I hope you don't have negative fallback from that, right? I hope that this doesn't compromise you professionally. Then I had the people that came up and basically just gave me a warning and said throughout the next day, like, that was really something. I don't think you realize what you did. There were funders in the room. There were other national organizations. There were partners. This is cross issue. And, I think that's really going to hurt you going forward in your career. And then, of course, I have the handful of people from our queer community that came up, some of which I knew, some of which I didn't, and, expressed that, like, courage and that fear. And what I didn't have, and this is maybe a little bit of a challenge back out to our audience, is to say, and LB, you and I were talking about this for a minute yesterday, is to say, where's the opportunity that I can support your work? I'm so excited we're finally having this conversation, right? And that was like a 1-minute response you gave yesterday about how do we build out on that? How do we fund this work to support rural young people? What are the programming needs, and how can I help? How can I partner and help amplify that, right? There was never a single question about how to be an ally, how to partner, how to generate resources, and how to walk it to the margins, right, in the intersections of other people. And it's been 10 years. I could tell you stories, but I'd hold hostage, the call of, I know people, and that it's like, that went cold on me, right? I know partners that went cold. I know I saw them at next events, right? It was never the same. And, being the first is, is always being acutely aware. So this is cutting back to the youth conversation, and to say that I am deeply committed, and I try to move through the world is saying, how we show up as a family in our community. I have an 18-year-old son, my partner and I have an 18-year-old son. How we show up in our community, how I show up, at schools, how I show up at workplaces, how I show up with young people, is wanting them to never have to have the experience of being the first, right? It's like always being on the stage. Lexi and Mike, it's like you were talking about, right? It's like always aware that you're constantly being watched, how you use humor and self-deprecating jokes to make that safe for people, right? To make them comfortable. And always trying to carry ourselves with dignity, but dignity comes with exhaustion. The other side of dignity is exhaustion. And if I know what that feels like as a white woman that has class climbed and is secure and safe, imagine, if you are listening to this conversation, what that means to be a woman of color, and to be a queer woman of color or a trans woman of color, right?
No, thank you. That's so great. And, you're talking about stepping into this world, putting yourself out there and open for judgment. And I think, like, when we talk about coming out or even doing work in queer advocacy, we're opening ourselves up. And a question we had from the audience was about like, how do we deal with safety and inclusion and affirming spaces? Like, how do we create all of that? Like, how can we let you be open and seen and still feel safe? And how do we navigate what those boundaries are? And Micah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this of how do we navigate those lines?
Yeah, so I've been working with youth for a number of years now, and for me, kind of I think the biggest way that we make those spaces safe is by being the example, and by setting those boundaries ourselves. And so for myself, coming into these spaces is very much, being myself in a way that's appropriate, and then also, showing them that it's okay to go through your life. It's okay to be a professional, to serve on these boards, to be involved in things, and living your truth, living who you are. And so for myself, I think a lot about like, are we doing anything where we would be putting boundaries or limiting the youth that we work with in their right to be who they are? Are we doing anything that would potentially cause them to not want to live their truth? And so for me, in building collaborations, a lot of it is, putting myself out there and saying like, this is who I am. And if I feel like I'm getting pushback just because of, my identity, I don't want to work with that organization, especially if they will do that to me as a professional. I don't want them working with our vulnerable youth. And so for a lot of that is kind of like putting myself out on the line, because I know I can take it. I know I'm not ashamed of who I am. And it's my responsibility to build those partnerships and, build those relationships with resources. So I don't have an issue with that. For others, it's a lot of, learning about things and being educated. For me, I've had to do a lot of educating for myself in terms of, what are the different ways that youth are expressing themselves, or, coming into the queer community, like realizing there's so much more I need to learn, about gender identity. How does that, how does it differentiate from like, there's just so many things from your sexual orientation. And so for myself, I don't want to put any restrictions on the youth. And a lot of it also has to do with, monitoring the language that happens within our programs. So I know when I first started working with youth, especially teenagers, they would always be like, well, that's gay. Or, like when they didn't like something that wasn't, when they didn't agree with something and they didn't like something. And so my favorite comeback for that was like, well, that's an object and it doesn't have a sexual orientation. So no, it's not gay. You can say like, that's lame. You say, I don't agree with that. I don't like that. And so for a lot of it, it's also teaching them, how do they create the safe space or these inclusive spaces for their peers? So a lot of it has to do with, educating them. That way they can create those spaces themselves. And, as I worked with the youth, I do start to hear them calling each other out or calling each other in. And so it's always kind of that little bit of like, okay, it's catching on, it's working.
I love that. I had a friend who would use that's gay, like colloquially, and I would be like, what if every time something went bad, I was like, stop being such a Carl. Why are you a Carl right now? I was like, and eventually you're like, wow, this is shitty, right? Like, and giving that context, yeah. And I, as we all kind of talk about like, coming outs and our own like experiences within that, and the work we're constantly doing. Do you guys ever feel kind of like a sacrificial lamb, of like, how has that shown up for you? And, not to call out our crowd, but I was like, man, we got quiet about comments and questions once we got like 4 queer folk on the line, like it's a hard reality to face of our own internal bias. And any folks that are feeling uncomfortable, I would like to say there's an awesome implicit bias test. The first time I took it and I came back racist, I was like, I'm not a racist. This can't be right. And then I took it and I was also sexist and homophobic. And it made me realize more of like the biases I'm geared toward, not the actions I do, but the way my mind thinks before it thinks. So I'd encourage you, if you're feeling uncomfortable, go do those, check in with yourself. But what have been instances in your life where you've kind of felt like putting yourself out there, like we all talk about, just so the next community doesn't have to. What's been an experience you've had of stepping up to the stage, hoping no one else has to do this?
I can go ahead with that one. One specific memory that comes to mind is I'm a seasoned pageant girl along with Miss Carlos over there, and that's actually how we met, was through pageantry, tribal pageants. And I was Miss Hopi 2014, 2015. And during that year, I remember specifically because that's when gay marriage was in session. Like, they were debating about gay marriage. They were trying to figure out, do we even give these people, I remember hearing that language used about these people, basic human rights. And I remember when they ruled that it was legal, that gay marriage was written into law. And it sounds funny now, when I think about it, but I remember seeing, if anyone else remembers, that's when everyone was putting that filter on their photos, and it was like the rainbow, or it was like the equality sign. And at that time, because I was tribal royalty, I was very much in the public eye. I was very much in public scrutiny, and there was I used that filter on one of my photos with my crown and sash on, and a couple of my relatives had seen it, and they had texted my mom, and they said, "Have you seen Lexi's profile picture? Have you seen like what she's talking about?" And I had made like a big long post about accepting, our relatives and accepting our friends and family, all of this stuff. And people were texting and like going out of their minds, texting my mom, and my mom like was like, "You're a public figure, you're an ambassador for the tribe, and I really think you should take that down." And I said, if I'm an ambassador for our tribe, for all the people enrolled, and I'm not speaking up we have relatives that are gay, we have relatives that are queer. I have a couple like cousins who are lesbian. I have a couple relatives who are bisexual. There's a few transgender people in our community. If I'm not speaking up for them, can I consider myself a tribal ambassador if I'm not speaking up for everybody? Not just the straight folks, not just everyone that they deem normal and acceptable, but everybody. This encompasses everybody, because what if one day I have a child, or my sibling, or a grandchild even down the road, who wants to run in pageants and is openly lesbian, transgender, or bisexual, or however they identify. I want them to feel comfortable being themselves in that position. And if I have to be the one that they all talk about, because res talk gets around very quickly. And if I have to be the one that they talk about, oh, there's that Lexi, she was the gay Miss Hopi, she was the gay Miss USA, all of this, that's fine. I really don't mind, but that just makes it more comfortable for the next girls that are going to come in and lead, and feel that I can be myself, because Lexi was up there, and Lexi's a rebel. I don't care, what happens, what people say. And if I can set that norm and make it safe for girls to do that, then that's what I'll do. And so that's probably one of the biggest times in my life where I had to say that to my mom. If anyone knows my mom, I'm like scared of my mother. And so having to sit there and have that conversation with Jackie was a big, I'm pretty sure I didn't breathe that whole time, but that was probably one of the times where I set myself in that position to be that sacrificial lamb, so that in the coming years it's easier for them.
Isn't it sad that the hardest people to come out to are our family, right? Like that unconditional love is where it's like the hardest. Sometimes, like parents out there on the call, like tell your kid like you'd be cool. It doesn't mean that they're going to be queer, but tell them if they are, you'd be cool with it, and tell them regularly, and make sure they know that you would love them in spite of, maybe have gay friends, maybe invite queer friends for dinner, help, like, again, we don't have an agenda, like we're all just meeting each other. But just opening up the space for people to be themselves. Yeah, absolutely. And then, we had a comment here that talks about someone we had who talks about as a young gay kid in the South and coming out feels dangerous, right? And it's borderline apocalyptic. I know that was my own experience. I'd always been out. We grew up in an old house, so we didn't even have closets, so I didn't know how to get in one. So I was just always an out kid. And, I was met with like pretty gross physical violence throughout my life, and that was just a norm. And you have physical safety on the line. So it's part of this, like we're talking about, how do you create a space where someone knows they can come be safe? Do you have an adult in your life that if this happens to you, they can come tell you and you can press charges and like take action and protect these kids? Like, are you creating a space? Because it's happening and you don't know about it. My family didn't know about it for years. It's happening and you don't even know what your kids are going through if you're not opening that line of communication, if we're not creating that space for you. And I was really excited in that comment where it talks about like their hope is that in being a true queer and presenting self, that they give someone else the strength. And like we talked about, you never want to be the sacrificial lamb, but on the other side, I have been honored to work with youth who now don't have to go through that. They know they have a space. They know they have somewhere to come. And Kim, as our most experienced queer on the panel, I'd love to hear your life, because I think about how much the internet has changed, how Lexi talked about the Oberfell ruling, like just happening of what seemed like overnight. And just what that's looked like for you of creating spaces for people to be their true selves.
Yeah, so can I have the tagline, the most experienced queer on the panel? Like, is that, like, can I just carry that forward? That was a really diplomatic, spin you put on that. I appreciate that. So, first, I just want to piggyback on the question. So I'm not diverting from the question, LB, but I just want to piggyback on what you were saying and to the audience and some of the questions coming in. Which is that from an allyship place, maybe your community has, a GSA in the school, right? Maybe it has some local parents and friends of lesbians, gay, or whatever that looks like, whatever that space looks like. If it does, show up. Don't just show up on Pride, right? Show up. Last year, the Trevor Project, this is the 2021 study. So this year, let me just double check my number here. 42, so this is hot off the press. Their project says that they surveyed 35,000 queer young people across the country, and 42% of those LGBTQ youth admitted that they had considered attempting suicide this year. So that's nationally. We need you to hold this and think about this in your community. And what that looks like if you don't have those places is think about, what do you know about queer people in your community? What are the challenges living there? What are their lived experiences? Are you just showing up to get nurtured and fired up, or are you really showing up to do this walk with them? If you don't know queer young people in your community, that's a flag to yourself, right? Like, our communities aren't that big. It's not hard to find them. And how might you welcome them? How might you invest in them in the rural return? How might you say to the teachers in your school, how to support these kids, and also queer teachers in your school, because I promise you they're the only one. What are the books that sit in your libraries? When have you looked at parents? Like one of the things that, was as a queer parent and as the first, even though not right, would have been to be like, whenever someone said, if you need X, and those moments were few and far between, right? Whatever that looked like. Invite those people into your house. Like, we have an open table policy at our house, right? The door is always open. We will always find a chair to add. Do you do that? Because if you haven't actually had for young people in your house and fed them a meal, then you're not really being an ally, right? You're being performative. The other thing is that I just want to say to that young person and to all the young people out there listening and all the young parents out there listening, right? And just across the community, that you are gorgeous. right? And you matter. And we think you are absolutely beautiful. And you, everything LB said, we need to make sure that you are safe, you know? And so I'm just gonna say right now that you can reach out to us if you do not feel safe, and we will work with you to make a safety plan. Micah and Lexi, I think you're up for this too, but I don't want to put you on the spot. I know I can commit LB and myself to doing that. So you can privately drop that in the chat right now if you need that, and we will help you figure that out. Otherwise, you have a whole life to live ahead of you. Your community is so incredibly fortunate to have you, and you have so much talent to share, and we want to keep you in your rural community and in your Native community. We don't want you feeling like you have to leave and run away. So, yeah.
Thank you, Kim. That's absolutely something I know at times our queer identities and our rural, our Indigenous, our various BIPOC identities feel in conflict because we're not told both of those can exist, that you can't be the and you can. You are the and. You already are. There is no gap. And as we round out what has been, for me, a very heart-filling conversation, I'd like to ask you guys, and I'll ask you to be brief on this one, but what is allyship to you? If you have a couple sentences to sum it up, what is allyship?
I'll go first since my mic is still, on. Allyship to me is sharing the platform and, more importantly, asking yourself the question, what will you give up? What are you willing to give up? Because ultimately, that's what it means to be an
ally. For myself, I think for me to be an ally, it's always pass the mic. How do I amplify the voices of those who are in the community that is disadvantaged or is not at the table? I understand, it's not always an opportunity to bring in somebody who is a member of the community, but how do we make it more accessible? Is it providing funds so that those people can afford to come to these tables, to these conversations, so that they can speak? Is it introducing literature, pieces that they've published or written? That way it's their words explicitly and directly. Native communities, they're so vast and they're so different, even those that are closely related to each other. So for myself, I can never say that I could speak on behalf of other Native Indigenous communities, and even for myself, within my own community, there's so many different opinions and stuff. So it's always, bring somebody to the table who's a member of that community. And if it's not possible, how can I make it possible?
To me, allyship means that I'm not going to have to do it alone. And I think I'm thinking of that mental, emotional support. And hopefully down the road somewhere, it won't have to be, I need that support. It will just come organically. And so I think that's the ultimate goal that everyone's working towards, is that we won't have to have separate anything. It's going to be inclusive, and we're going to highlight those voices and make it so that hopefully maybe my grandchildren, my kids, great grandchildren won't have to feel like they need to come out, that there'll be enough allies, there'll be enough support and love, that they'll just be free to be themselves, and there won't be any fear about it. And I think that's what allyship means to me, that I'm not going to have to do this alone.
I love that. Thank you guys so much. I think there is a telling silence. And when we ask, how has allyship failed you? We all have stories. And when we're asked to define it, it's hard because, we're let down consistently by folks that we hope to be allies. And so our communities out there who maybe have privilege, own it, show up, be big and loud and proud, and realize that when we're doing that, it's a lot of our own mental health and physical safety on the line. Do the work for us. Show up and you create the space and let us come fill it, and really lean into vocalizing it and hold people accountable when we're not in the room. When there's not folks from our oppressed communities that are represented, hold other people accountable. When that joke that you not know isn't a joke is made, don't laugh. I'm not asking you to challenge folks toe to toe, but suck the air out of the room. Like, ask why that joke doesn't land and make it stay in an uncomfortable silence. Ask someone to explain that homophobic joke. Ask them to explain that to you, and let folks reckon with their own understanding of what that's meant. And, you know, as we have this conversation, I also do want to say, like, though I have loved and enjoyed this panel and the conversations, none of us are a monolith of rural queer community. There are so many more voices and understanding that we haven't had represented that we're all wanting to learn and that we're all wanting to embrace and show up for. So when you talk about your own journey to allyship, maybe you're a white, cis, straight person, we're also working on our own allyship of communities we don't identify with. So you're not alone in this journey. There's folks who want to also learn more and understand more, and we're here with you. And thank you all so much for joining into this conversation and listening and wanting to wake up tomorrow and do better. Thank you.